The job of commanding Apollo 13 fell to Jim Lovell. By this time, Lovell was already a veteran of 3 spaceflights. In 1965, Lovell was aboard Gemini 7 with Frank Borman when the two men spent 14 days in space, at that time a space endurance record. He went on to command Gemini 12, the final mission of the Gemini program. And in December of 1968, Lovell was command module pilot when Apollo 8 became the first manned mission to the moon. Scheduled to join Lovell on Apollo 13 was command module pilot Ken Mattingly. Mattingly was part of the support crew for Apollo 8 and trained as backup command module pilot for Apollo 11. Selected to serve as lunar module pilot was Fred Haise. Haise had served as backup lunar module pilot for Apollos 8 and 11 before being assigned to Apollo 13. According to Jim Lovell, preparations for the Apollo 13 flight went flawlessly. Set to launch on April 11, 1970, the crew of Apollo 13 hit a snag just a week before liftoff. Backup lunar module pilot Charlie Duke had been stricken with the German measles and unwittingly exposed the Apollo 13 crew. Because Ken Mattingly had not had the German measles before, NASA doctors worried he might fall ill during the mission, and he was therefore bumped from the flight. Backup command module pilot Jack Swigert would therefore move into the primary role. Finally, on the morning of April 11th, with the crew issues resolved, Jim Lovell, Fred Haise, and Jack Swigert readied themselves for launch. After completing breakfast, the crew suited up before heading to Launch Complex 39A for an on-time liftoff.
This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, T-minus 1 hour, 9 minutes, 59 seconds, and counting. At this time in the command module, Odyssey, the 3 crewmen, spacecraft commander Jim Lovell, command module pilot Jack Swigert, and lunar module pilot Fred Haise are very busy. The spacecraft commander and command module pilot are configuring the stabilization and control system for liftoff and aligning that system with the guidance platform aboard the spacecraft. Also going on at this time is a check of the large propulsion system engine below the service module. This engine can be gimbaled in response to commands. This is done in 2 ways, and these systems are being checked out at this time. There is a thumb wheel control which can set the engine to a preset position for certain maneuvers, and also a rotational hand controller which can be used for the actual flight of a maneuver. These checks are being made now, the engine being gimbaled, with spacecraft commander Jim Lovell indicating the position that he is putting these to, and readouts are being made to ensure that the engine is gimbaling in proper response. Also at this time, a final checkout by the crew of the entry monitoring system. Also a final setting of this system. Our countdown proceeding well at this time, T-minus 1 hour, 8 minutes, 40 seconds. This is Kennedy Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control. We're just passing the 1 hour mark in our countdown. Now in the final hour of the countdown toward the launch of Apollo 13. The closeout crew has now left the White Room area and will be standing by for the retraction to the 12-degree position of swing arm number 9. Now at T-minus 57 minutes, 15 seconds and counting, this is Kennedy Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control as we move into the final half hour of our countdown. T-minus 29 minutes, 56 seconds and counting. The Brevard Sheriff's Department, Brevard County, Florida, has reported that along Route 1, the closest major highway to Kennedy Space Center, there are some 100,000 people and 25,000 cars parked watching for the launch of Apollo 13. Along the Indian and Banana Rivers, it's reported that both rivers are literally filled with boats and spectators standing by to watch the launch. Our countdown continuing now. The power transfer test underway, T-minus 29 minutes, 13 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control. This is Apollo Saturn Launch Control, T-minus 9 minutes, 58 seconds and counting. The 3rd stage start tanks are now beginning their chill down. 3rd stage scheduled to ignite at 9 minutes, 22 seconds into the mission. Also going on at this time is one of the computer checks which are carried out throughout the final portion of the launch. This particular one is a checkout of the launch vehicle digital computer to ensure that it's ready for launch. A final check of the weather indicates that earlier worries about the weather have come to naught. Weather looks good and is satisfactory, presents no constraint to our launch. Now T-minus 9 minutes, 25 seconds and counting. This is Kennedy Launch Control. We're now approaching the T-minus 1 minute mark. T-minus 1 minute, T-minus 1 minute and counting. Now in the final minute of our countdown. At the 30-second mark, swing arm number 1 will retract. T-minus 50 seconds. As we pass the T-minus 50-second mark, the power transfer takes place. First stage, second stage, third stage, and the instrument unit going to internal power. T-minus 37 seconds, and our count continues to go well. We'll be looking for an ignition of those 5 first stage engines at the T-minus 8.9 second mark. We've passed T-minus 30, T-minus 25 seconds and counting, and Apollo 13 is go. T-minus 20 seconds, T-minus 20 seconds and counting. 17, guidance release, 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9, 8. Ignition sequence has started. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. We have committed, we have liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust.
Plug is ready. AP11. Zero program.
And it has cleared the tower.
Clear the tower. Zero complete. Roll program. Houston, roger, roll. 13 Houston, go in 30 seconds. Roll complete and we're pitching. Roger that. Stand by for mode 1 Bravo. Mark 1 Bravo. 1 Bravo. Command. 13 Houston, go at 1. We show the cabin relieving. 13 roger. 13 Houston, stand by for mode 1 Charlie. Mark, you're 1 Charlie. Mark, 1 Charlie. And 13, you're go for staging. Go for staging. S2 ignition. Roger. 13 Houston, trajectory's good, thrust is good. Roger. Skirt. Tower jet. We confirm skirts up, roger. Tower jet, mode 2, Jim, looking good. Mode 2. Guidance initiate. 13 Houston, coming up 5 minutes, you're looking perfect, over. 13, roger. Stand by for S4B to orbit. Mark, you have S4B to orbit, Jim. Roger, we have S4B to orbit. 13 Houston, you are go for staging. 13, roger, go for staging. Staging. Roger, staging. And S4 ignition, Houston. Roger that, Jim, thrust looks good. Roger. Apollo 13, Houston, your go at 11.5 and predicted cutoff time is 12 plus 3-4, over. Understand, 12 plus 3-4 predicted cutoff time. Apollo 13, Houston, you have a go orbit all sources and the booster is safe, over. Go orbit and the booster is safe, thank you, Joe. Don't mention it.
Despite the premature shutdown of the Saturn V's second stage inboard engine, the crew of Apollo 13 achieved Earth orbit. At 1 hour, 42 minutes and 16 seconds mission elapsed time, the crew of Apollo 13 was given the go for translunar injection, the rocket burn that would send them toward the moon. Then, less than an hour later, the burn complete, Apollo 13 was on its way. By day 3 of the mission, Apollo 13 was more than 140,000 nautical miles from Earth. The day started with the crew fast asleep. All systems on board the spacecraft were functioning normally. The flight plan called for a light workload this day, highlighted by a televised tour of the lunar module later in the day. At 54 hours 55 minutes since their launch, The crew of Apollo 13 was at an altitude of over 176,000 nautical miles, traveling nearly 3,300 feet per second. The TV transmission was scheduled to begin in 5 minutes. Inside Mission Control, serving as flight director, was former Marine fighter pilot Eugene Kranz. Kranz had been at NASA since Project Mercury, during which he wrote many of the procedures used by Mission Control and served as assistant flight director for Scott Carpenter's Aurora 7 mission in 1962. The man serving as capsule communicator was future Skylab and Space Shuttle astronaut Jack Lousma. Lousma joined NASA in 1966 and served on the support crews of Apollo 9 and 10. At exactly 55 hours and 8 seconds mission elapsed time, he radioed the crew to tell them Houston was ready for the TV transmission. 15 minutes later, the astronauts were beaming television images from inside the command and lunar modules. During the 30-minute transmission, Lovell was shown traversing the tunnel that joined the two spacecraft. Haise demonstrated a new innovation for their walk on the moon, a drink bag that was placed inside the neckring of their spacesuit that would allow them to drink while on the lunar surface. They also transmitted images of their ultimate destination. At 55 hours, 46 minutes, and 11 seconds mission elapsed time, the TV transmission was concluded.
This is the crew of Apollo 13. Wish everybody there a nice evening, and we're just about ready to close out our inspection of Aquarius and get back for a pleasant evening at Odyssey. Good night.
Thank you, 13.
Minutes after the conclusion of the TV transmission, Electrical, Environmental, and Consumables Manager, or ECOM, Cy Liebergott, requested the crew stir the supercooled oxygen in the spacecraft oxygen tank to prevent the gas from getting slushy due to its cold temperature. Capcom Jack Lousma radioed the request to the crew of Apollo 13.
We've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like you to stir up your cryo tanks.
Okay. Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Yes, sir. Houston, we've had a problem.
During the third day of their outward-bound journey from Earth, an explosion on board the spacecraft prevented the command module's fuel cells from creating the electrical power needed to sustain the vehicle's operation. With no electrical power available, the crew of Apollo 13 would eventually abandon the command module and take up residence in the lunar module for most of the remainder of their journey. With 3 people living aboard a vehicle designed to accommodate only 2, the lunar module was quickly filling with the carbon dioxide the 3 men were exhaling. Test Director Jim LeBlanc describes what happened in the moments following the explosion.
The subsystem managers who were responsible for the subsystems were racking their brains, looking at the data, trying to find out what they really need to worry about. It became pretty clear pretty early that lithium hydroxide was going to be a very limiting factor.
The crew was soon running low on the round lithium hydroxide filters used to scrub the air of the carbon dioxide accumulating inside the lunar module. Without the filters, the crew would soon succumb to carbon dioxide poisoning. Because no one was living on board the command module, there was little need to scrub its air of carbon dioxide. There were plenty of lithium hydroxide filters available, therefore, from the command module. The only problem? Those filters were square, while the lunar modules were round. NASA was literally faced with the dilemma of putting a square peg into a round hole. A team from the Crew Systems Division was quickly assembled to solve this puzzle. Once again, Jim LeBlanc.
When we heard about the problem, initially it was just an explosion. We didn't know what the end result was, what the real problem was. Our policy was when there was a mission up, we had our chambers in a already standby position. And what that means is we had them all the systems checked out. We had all the consumables, oxygen, nitrogen, all the supplies we needed, lithium hydroxide, in fact. We had that standing by.
Another member of the assembled team was Tom Wilks. Wilks came to work at NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center in 1964 as a logistics technician. He was promoted to altitude test technician in 1966. By the time of the Apollo 13 mission, Wilks also served as a rescue technician and volunteer test subject. He picks up the story of the development and testing of the device conceived to help save the crew of Apollo 13.
We were given a list of what we could use to build an adapter to fit the Apollo Command Module lithium hydroxide canisters to the LEM environmental control system to scrub or take out the carbon dioxide that was being breathed by the now 3 crewmen in their lifeboat on the way home.
The items on the list included a flight manual cover, duct tape, 2 suit hoses, 2 socks, bungee cord, and plastic bags.
So what we did is we put this together all in a 3-hour time and got it ready for testing.
Hours after being handed a list of items, Ed Smiley, chief of the Crew Systems Division, his assistant Jim Corial, and a handful of engineers and test directors had rigged a life-saving device. As the altitude test technician, it was now Wilks' job to test the device in condition mimicking those aboard the Apollo 13 lunar module. Wilks recounts what he did next.
We started running checklists for the 11-foot chamber. The LEM ECS system was there, and it was identical to the one on the moon and on the way home that they used.
The 11-foot chamber was a vacuum chamber containing a high-fidelity operational lunar module cabin complete with an environmental control system, or ECS, exactly like the one aboard the Apollo 13 lunar module. Test Director Jim LeBlanc next remembers how the testing proceeded.
We had the capability of injecting CO2 into the chamber at a fixed rate. And the fixed rate in this case would be the metabolic rate of these 3 people. The astronauts were calibrated before flight, so their metabolic rate versus CO2 output was known.
The test established the effectiveness of the newly developed filtration system. Soon, mission controllers radioed to the crew instructions on how to assemble the device. Within 30 minutes of its completion, carbon dioxide fell to safe levels aboard the spacecraft. The problem had been successfully resolved. At 68 hours 47 minutes mission elapsed time, the crew emerged from their rest period to prepare for the upcoming trip around the moon. While mission controllers continued to monitor the systems of the command and lunar modules, astronauts in the lunar module simulator were practicing maneuvers the crew would need to successfully swing around the moon back toward Earth. Then, more than 77 hours since its launch from the Kennedy Space Center, and while 421 nautical miles above the lunar surface, the crew of Apollo 13 slipped behind the moon. Out of sight of Earth, there was no radio contact with the crew. Mission controllers would have to wait for Apollo 13 to re-emerge from behind the moon to confirm their planning had worked and the crew was indeed heading home. At 77 hours 38 minutes mission elapsed time, NASA's Public Affairs Officer announced what mission controllers already knew. Apollo 13 had indeed rounded the corner and was heading back toward Earth. Over the course of the next several days, the crew had to adapt to the cramped and cold environment they were living in, while mission controllers on the ground wrestled with developing new procedures to get the astronauts home. Day 6 would be a busy one for the astronauts. Scheduled to splash down this day, there would be a final course correction undertaken to ensure a safe return through the atmosphere before splashing down in the Pacific Ocean. But first, the command module would have to be reactivated.
Aquarius, Houston. Go ahead. Okay, your go to start powering up the command module. Right, we're starting now.
Also, before they could return home, the crew would have to jettison the damaged part of their vehicle called the service module, as it was not designed to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. What the astronauts saw when they released the service module shocked them all.
Copy that.
We copied that report from Jim Lovell of service module separation at 138 hours, 2 minutes, 8 seconds.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. Is that right? Right by the high gain antenna, the whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine.
As the service module drifted away, the crew still had left to jettison their lifeboat, the lunar module they named Aquarius.
Left jettison.
Okay, copy that. Farewell, Aquarius, and we thank you.
This is Apollo Control Houston at 141 hours, 31 minutes into the flight. We've had lunar module jettison. Apollo 13, the age of Aquarius ended at 141 hours, 30 minutes, ground elapsed time.
With their command module back online and free from no longer needed hardware, the crew readied for the final leg of their trip home, a fiery re-entry through the atmosphere and a splashdown in the Pacific Ocean.
Odyssey Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Extremely loud applause as Apollo 13 on main chutes comes through loud and clear on the television display here.
The crew of Apollo 13 had come within 3.5 miles of the recovery vessel USS Iwo Jima. The astronauts were picked up by helicopter and transported to the ship, where they received a red carpet welcome and a congratulatory call from the President of the United States. For their part, flight directors Gene Kranz, Glenn Lunny, Jerry Griffin, and Milt Windler received the Presidential Medal of Freedom for their work in getting the crew of Apollo 13 home safely.